All right. Well, hello, everybody. My name's Nicole Hale. I'm the VP of Marketing here at New Fire Global Partners. And I would like to thank you all for joining us on our webinar today titled Pro Tips for Managing Remote Teams. So this is part of the education series at New Fire Global Partners, and we're happy to have you. So before I jump in, I just want to go over some housekeeping specifics. If you have any questions during this webinar, feel free to write them directly in the chat box. We'll be capturing all the questions and answering as many as we possibly can at the end of the webinar. Additionally, we'll be following up after the webinar through email to all of the registrants with a full list of the questions and answers, as well as a link to watch this webinar or pass it along to your colleagues afterwards. All right, so let's get started. First and foremost, I just want to say that we'd like to thank all the healthcare workers who are out there tirelessly working day in and day night. You know, they're on the front lines of this COVID-19, and they're there to help ensure that folks like you and I can be safe and able to continue our work as usual. Even though these times seem turbulent, without these people really urging us to stay home so they can do their job and do the hard work, our families and our workforces wouldn't have the security that we have today, and for this, we thank them. So speaking of this topic, given this current global health pandemic, I know many of us are in a unique situation. We might not have found ourselves here before, right? Sure, maybe we've managed large teams, maybe we've handled certain crisis situations, and I'm sure occasionally ran the virtual meeting. But for many of us, managing completely distributed teams in entirely remote organizations is uncharted territory. So that's why we're here today. I'd like to introduce our speakers who they've been doing that for a while and been quite successful at it. So our first speaker is Steve Howe. He's the CEO of New Fire Global Partners, who we offer hundreds of software development partners across the globe. We're serving innovative companies by helping them solve some of the world's toughest problems. Steve's also a well-known entrepreneur in the tech space, and I must say he's a mighty fine wine connoisseur. Our second speaker today is Dr. Jeff Sutherland. He's the co-creator of Scrum and founder of Scrum Inc. I'm sure many of you on the call actually are familiar with what Scrum is, but those who are not, Scrum is the most popular software development methodology used by 80% of developers across the world. Dr. Sutherland is also an advisor to New Fire Global Partners, as well as a Tesla collector, because if you can, you should. So I would like to invite both Steve and Jeff to turn on their cameras and join us now. Say hi, guys. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you to get.
Thanks, Nicole. Appreciate it. Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Doing great. Great to see you again, Steve.
Yeah, good to see you. So I've got a little bit of a surprise for you, which I'm sure is exactly what you want to hear right before a live or during a live broadcast. But I was able to get a couple old photos of us. So back in the Wayback Machine. These are, I think, circa 1999. So before the turn of the century, before the beginning of the new millennium. I was a young founder of a digital health company, and you were the veteran CTO that our venture capitalist friends, brought in. I have to say, you look pretty much exactly the same as you did over 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think that, how you do that is probably the topic of a whole nother presentation, right? But in spirit of full disclosure, obviously Jeff and I have been colleagues and friends for over 20 years, and I'll just say, Jeff, if you ever invent a time machine, go back and tell me to get a haircut and maybe get an iron to iron my dress shirts. So I guess back then we were living out of our suitcases, living in hotels all the time, which I guess is the opposite of today because we're all kind of work from home, and it brings to kind of the topics that Jeff and I wanted to cover. So Jeff and I and other leaders, we've been having a lot of conversations about kind of the unique situation we have in the world today and how it affects kind of the business environment. And based on a lot of the conversations we've had, we thought three topics would be worth covering today with this group. First, kind of work from home, which a lot of people are doing, versus remote teams, similar but not the same. We wanted to talk about some of the key Scrum principles which, we feel, it was something that Jeff has been thinking about for decades, but really kind of a guide for remote teams today. And we also wanted to talk about company culture. Sometimes that feels a little squishy, but for me and for Jeff, it's pretty important, and we think it's even more important today than ever. Also, we wanted to make this a quick presentation, 30 minutes. We'll be relatively fast-paced. We realize that most of you have probably been on video conferences for most of the day, so we'll keep this pretty short. So the good news is, yes, you're working from home, but for most of us, we have some experience in this, right? I remember the first couple times years ago when I worked from home, the realization I had was, wow, I'm actually really productive. And maybe, you've had, a similar experience. But working from home, and again, managing remote teams, not exactly the same. As I mentioned, Jeff and I have had lots of conversations with different business leaders. I was talking to JJ Sutherland, the CEO of Scrum Inc., and he shared kind of an interesting tidbit he had heard, which was, how do you in the workplace, how do you announce your presence? How do you show that you're there? Well, if you're in an office, you show up. You go to the meeting, and people see you in the lunchroom or whatever, and that's how you show your presence. However, when you work remotely, interestingly, how you show your presence, how you show that you're there is you add value. And I think that's an interesting insight. And, we'll be tapping into that a little bit more. We'll be exploring that in today's talk. So as I mentioned, we've all worked from home, but it's not really the same thing as managing remote teams. And especially for, times like today, you have to think beyond just kind of your normal work from home situation. You're thinking about not just individuals, but you're thinking about your teams now remote. And for many companies at the moment, it's a company-wide experience. The entire company is working from home. So, that's very different than just an individual working from home for the day. And also, as I'm implying, this is for an extended period. Currently, for some companies, it's indefinite. It's we're in the middle of a global health crisis. When is it over? Well, obviously, there's some debate about that. So when we all come back to the office, for many of us, it's unknown. And, Jeff and I have, I think, the advantage that when we were building our companies, we knew there would be a remote component. For some people that we're talking to, this has happened very quickly. And it's a situation where, maybe there wasn't much preparation, maybe no preparation at all. And so that's something that we realized and wanted to acknowledge. The interesting thing is, when your team, when you have a remote workforce, in some ways it's a little bit like a parallel universe. Some things are the same, and some things are a little different. And a point I think Jeff and I often make is that when you work with remote teams, sometimes it highlights, it puts a focus on strengths and weaknesses that were already there. So, for example, in strengths, if your company has a strong culture, good leadership, I think you'll see that come through even when the team is remote. When there's strong management, discipline management, when the team, they know their goals, they know the company goals, they know their individual goals, that will actually serve the organization well in this remote setting. The flip side is, sometimes when people go remote, they feel like there's weaknesses. And I would argue the weaknesses were probably already there. They're just being surfaced now because you're working in a remote environment. So, for example, if the management isn't as strong, if goals are unclear, if leadership hasn't done a good job presenting what the goals are, and individuals themselves they don't know their goals, well, that's going to manifest itself and be very clear when working remote. And for those of us in software development and technology, a great example is when there's weak backlog. If you're all kind of together in an office, sometimes you can kind of get away with that, but I have found at least, when the teams are remote, if the backlog is not strong, if the specifications aren't clear, well, that kind of amplifies and becomes extremely visible to everyone when the teams are remote. So where to start? So some common questions that we've been hearing, from managers. It's a funny question. They ask, well, how do I know if my team is actually working when they're remote? And often my question back is, how do you know when they're actually working when they're in the office, right? If you don't know if your team is making progress or not, then them being in the office, as a manager, you're only taking attendance. You're not really kind of managing them. So I don't think that's really a new question, a new issue, just because you're remote. And similarly, when people say, well, does my management style have to change when the team is remote? The answer is maybe it might have to change, but it's not so much because they're remote. It's because, again, I think when teams are remote, it puts a spotlight on things that maybe weren't working. So, for example, setting up goals. If that wasn't clear to begin with, it'll become clear very soon as more and more of the company becomes remote. So we're going to focus on a few specific areas. One, how to make sure the team is delivering value. The second is to make sure the communication is open and effective. And then, of course, that there are feedback mechanisms. Like the communication isn't one way, but people are really talking. So let me address a couple of those right now, which is, I often say to deliver value, you have to define value. And another phrase I use probably too often is, even leaders need to be led. What you find in these situations is there are a lot of important things to do, but the real question is, what's the most important thing right now? And that's really a management discipline of all the possible things that I could be working on that would add value. Really, as a team, what should we be focused on right now? Now, obviously, when Jeff gets to talking about some of these Scrum ceremonies, clearly some of these ceremonies are dedicated to attacking that question. The other thing I'll add is activity versus results. That's often a problem in lots of organizations. We get focused on the activity, but not the actual results. And again, I think this becomes even more apparent in a remote setting. So, some classic examples are for sales teams. It's really not about how many phone calls did you make. It's, how did you close business or not? And with our software development teams, it's not so much how many lines of code did you write. It's how much ship-ready, product increment did you create? How much business value did you generate? Jeff, you agree with that sentiment?
Absolutely. I was meeting with one of the biggest companies in the world, the leadership, and they all said, we're all working 80 hours a week. We all have 5 leading initiatives that we're working on. We're working day and night. And I said, are you getting any of the initiatives done? They said, no. I said, oh, I think if you worked on one at a time, you could only work 40 hours a week and you would actually get some of these things done. Do you want to try that? And they said, oh, we can't possibly do that. And when I asked why not, I discovered they're being measured by activity, showing up, going to meetings, doing a lot of activity, but nobody's measuring them for getting anything done, which is really not the way to run a company.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Let me add one more. Let me hit the slide, and then I think you were going to talk about some of the Scrum ceremonies that are extremely helpful as for remote teams. And then, I think this is often a great opportunity when you're remote to get cross-functional. Often when you hear, hey, these are the business people and these are the technical people, and there's 2 separate groups and they're not talking to each other, that's obviously a recipe for disaster. I hope if some good can come of the current situation is that this is an opportunity to rethink about how teams work together and in this situation, in this example, get really cross-functional, to have business people and technical people working together, really talking, really identifying where the value is. And then when those understandings are achieved, sharing those outcomes broadly with the organization.
Okay, so one of the reasons that Scrum has become the dominant agile practice in the world is because it works very well for one team. It scales to multiple teams across the globe, and it can work as well remotely as it does locally. So it's a perfect tool for what we're experiencing right now. And today, companies that are in the midst of this lockdown, smart companies are upgrading their tooling, whether it's Tesla upgrading their assembly line, so when they turn that thing back on, they produce more cars, or whether it's companies we're working with doing agile transformations, whether it's biotechs here in the Cambridge area where I am, or brewing companies or oil companies. We're working with companies all over the world. And every implementation is based on the cycle we call a sprint. It's the heartbeat of production. And today we like short sprints. At Scrum Inc., we run weekly sprints. 3M is the only company we've actually convinced to run weekly sprints everywhere. Most companies run 2-week sprints, but every sprint, you're delivering a workable increment of product that is potentially shippable to an end user. And so that focus makes Scrum extremely productive and extremely effective. And it's all driven by coming into the beginning of a sprint with a backlog that is really clear and really ready for implementation. And today, most teams are using user stories as the predominant item in the backlog. And a user story is written on a card or sticky note, and it really is a placeholder for a conversation. And these stories are today usually implemented in Scrum tooling, so everybody can see just as easily in India as in the United States or Russia. Everyone can see what is the backlog, who's working on what, how much is getting done. And the interesting thing is we published a number of research papers showing that if your backlog is really clear and in a ready state coming into that sprint, production immediately doubles. And if you can double production, it costs about $150K a year or a month for a team, and you can double production. That's an extra $150K a month of production times 12. You're talking millions of dollars more production per team just by getting backlog clear. As teams enter into the sprint, we find that the really effective teams implement a pattern we call swarming. People are working together, solving the problem. Instead of one person working just independently on their own backlog item, multiple people are working on that backlog item. And what happens is this increases what the lean guys understand as process efficiency. The actual work time divided by the clock time starts to go way up. And as soon as that happens, production increases. So by swarming, you can double the production again of a team. By swarming remotely, you not only pull the teams together remotely, but it actually gets everyone working together when often they could be, if they were home alone, just working on their own thing, they could be lonely, get less motivated. By working together and swarming, things work a lot better for people and for teams. So coming into the sprint planning, we have a backlog that's ready. We define a goal for the sprint, and that's a goal that's realistically achievable. One of the things we've discovered, I work with a venture capital group, and the investors were really surprised when they found that if a team finishes a sprint early, finishes all the backlog early, they start to go faster. They start to accelerate. And so our investors said, whoa, we've been trying to have people take more into a sprint, but if we do that, they won't accelerate. They'll just flatline. So we need to make sure in sprint planning, we take just enough, and there's a very clear goal. Every day, we're kind of checking on how well are we doing against that goal. What have we done yesterday? What are we doing today? What can we do that will make the whole team move faster towards the sprint goal? And at the end of a sprint, we review the increment that we've built, and we follow that with a retrospective. How can we get better? So if a team is constantly looking at, okay, how did things work during the last sprint? How can the sprint be better next time? At Scrum Inc., the team I'm on, everybody at Scrum Inc. is on a team. We're using the happiness metric in the retrospective to figure out, okay, what will make the team happier during the next sprint? Because if we can do that, we know that the team gets more productive. So it gets to be more fun, more productive, sprint to sprint. And you can get on an upward trajectory, which we see on really good teams. You get on this upward slope. You can see the black line, velocity will go up and down, but it'll be trending up. If you do a good retrospective and if you implement what is in the standard definition of Scrum and the Scrum Guide, if you implement moving a process improvement into the next sprint that's identified in the retrospective, we call that a Kaizen, then you can get on this 10% slope, and it can go on indefinitely. A lot of teams don't do that, and the symptom is the teams just never get any better. Okay, so the retrospective is really good in Scrum. So I'll turn it back over to Steve, and he can talk about some of his people.
Yeah, Jeff, that's great, and I'm also surprised when people don't invest in the retro, because it's basically saying you don't want to improve, right? So it's such an important investment. I think the retro ceremony, and so Jeff and I also want to talk a little about company culture. It's interesting. Again, we've got hundreds of really great software developers all over the world. And in a town hall we gave last year, I asked I asked the whole team, how would you describe our company culture? And one great developer said, we're kind of like a family of professionals, the people who work really hard, really care about their craft, but yet we support each other in a very kind of friendly, safe environment. So we sometimes refer to ourselves as a family of professionals. And the culture that we have, and it's funny, I think culture is often created by leadership, right? So the beliefs that are beliefs, and it's interesting in this time of challenge. I really feel company culture is so important. Some people say, hey, in times of uncertainty, they go to their religion. It kind of fills in the blanks for them. And I would say in the business community, in kind of teams who work in a business setting, company culture kind of plays that role in these kind of uncharted times. Company culture fills in the blanks for you. And so, we believe in continuous improvement, always willing to be challenged. We believe in open communication, which is really all about trust and, respecting the individual, understanding, especially since we've got people all over the world. People come from different backgrounds and they have different futures probably. And our time together is, is a time that we should respect each other. And we also believe in the leader servant, that upside down pyramid where, we're about leadership, not managers per se, but leaders that help unlock the potential of the team. And I think, Jeff, you feel pretty similarly about company culture, I believe, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And your values are really very similar to the Scrum values, which are openness, respect for people, courage to speak up. And that allows teams to really commit to deliver and focus on making stuff happen. So the Scrum values are, for my company, are the foundation of the culture. Yeah. So again, I really feel the company culture. It's we're putting our beliefs to the test here, and for a lot of leaders, business leaders out there, it's difficult times, but we're hoping this can be our finest hour, that we can be doing some of our best work. And here, a question about culture. This is funny. This is actually a photo of my home office. You can see the Kanban board back there. And Jeff, I've been to your house. I've seen your Kanban boards everywhere. I think you've got one on the kitchen fridge, right? I see a lot of post-it notes around your house. And this is just a funny example, but I think this was last week. I posted a photo of my home office. We all agreed to do social distancing, to do our part to try to flatten the curve and all that. And after I posted this photo on our random channel in Slack, minutes later, people were posting, with kind of a hashtag kind of feel, their work from home, their home offices, which I thought was very cool. And for me, it was both an example of our company culture being strong, even when the team's remote, when people were willing to share that kind of personal part of them, sharing they're part of their home life, and that's something very personal and very that they offered up. But also, I would say, also strengthened the company culture too, where we all kind of, it was a little bit of signal that we're all in this together. And
I know some companies are doing some very cool things, which we're also adopting. People are sharing because we're all at home now. They're sharing, what's for dinner tonight, where they're, because some of us are, maybe we eat out a lot now. We're actually having to cook. And some things that I know we're doing at New Fire Global Partners is that, we'll have virtual coffee meetings, a virtual coffee hour where people will be having coffee. And of course, when they're having coffee in the morning, it's the middle of the night for me. So it's a little bit awkward, but these are things that are pretty cool, I think, to continue to keep the culture strong.
Yeah. Last night we had dinner with some of the Scrum Inc. leadership on Zoom, and my wife has actually got a dinner party on Saturday night. It's going to be totally by Zoom.
That's cool.
It'll be very interesting.
That's great.
All right, great. Well, thank you both so much. And that's a really interesting thing, a dinner party through Zoom. I'll have to get an invite to one of those. Check that out. So we've gotten some great questions. In fact, so many of them, because we have so many attendees from across the world. I think we're getting hellos from Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Slovenia, all over the place. So hello, and thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, absolutely. So I know we wanted to keep this short, so we're going to try to address a few questions. I'm going to try to sort of, compact them together into themes here. I think a lot of people are asking a little bit about culture. So one question that I thought was an interesting one to sort of kick this off is, some people are working at organizations where the culture maybe isn't so great. Potentially it's already suffering, right? So how do we ensure that this remote working that has been put in place that wasn't being planned for doesn't hurt it anymore?
I think that's a great question. To be candid, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I feel if your organization has a weak culture, you're definitely at a disadvantage, and another organization has a strong culture. Unfortunately, that's reality. But this could be an opportunity to address some of that, right? I think, again, with remote teams, things that were previously hidden become very visible. It's not the problems weren't there. It's just now, it's now visible to everyone. So, I would hope this might be an opportunity for the organization to address that head on and to see, as a group, what can be done to improve company culture.
Well, the first thing you need to do is everybody needs to be clear on what needs to be done, and it needs to be prioritized, and then it needs to be visible to everybody. So, and then as soon as that visibility is there, you can see if anything is getting done. And then if you're doing a regular cycle of retrospective on why it's not getting done, then you're actually starting to tune up the culture. You have to have the tooling to do remote work that gives you then leverage to make the changes that are needed. And it's maybe even easier to get a better company culture remotely by working the process than it is locally, because locally, everybody can say, well, everything's okay. This is the way it's always been. It's kind of miserable, but we don't really need to change. But once everybody's remote, then everybody knows it's different. And so you have an opportunity. Every crisis is an opportunity. And this is a great one that we have right now.
That's great. That's a great way of, looking at the possibly negative side of this and turning it into a positive. I think a lot of people too were asking about, swarming, the concept of swarming, and how that can work really in a remote team environment. And how do you implement something like that now if you haven't been using it efficiently in such an environment?
Well, I've been working on a remote training deck all morning today, and on Slack I've been sending stuff back and forth to multiple people who are also working on the deck for this training. And my team recently decided after the daily meeting, everyone would stay on Zoom for 1 hour, and we'd blast through as much as we could together that was on the Scrum board. And our velocity tends to run around 200, but just that hour together after the daily meeting pumped it immediately to 260. So just by having more swarming, we got more production. So getting people collaborating always gets a better result, better ideas, higher quality, stuff gets done faster. And it's very easy for software developers to go, oh, if I just work by myself, then I won't be bothered and I will be more efficient as a developer. But actually, the way teams are really highly productive is they're not working individually. They're working together. They're collaborating on getting stuff done.
Yeah, Jeff, I like that comment you had about it fights loneliness as well, because, I think when you swarm, everyone's engaged. And I know in our teams, I don't think anyone's lonely. I think everyone's very engaged. So I think that was a pretty cool point.
Yeah, definitely. There's certainly a human aspect to all of this, right? So another thing that's come up here is we were talking about value and how you can really define and measure value. We talked broadly about it, but any sort of tips that you have for this audience of how they can truly define it and put some measurements around it?
Well, I think the context in the context of kind of technology and software development, it's really about a big aspect of it is, of course, business value, right? So, and I think that's part of the trying to create transparency, the cross-functional discussions, so that team members have visibility into the business value that's being created as a result of their work, of the activity. I think that's pretty fundamental to that. Jeff, what do you think?
Well, we want to measure product owners by value delivered per point their teams finish on the backlog. And so like at Scrum Inc., we're not a very large company, so we can actually tie revenue directly to the points delivered. And we can get a revenue per point for a product owner. And we want that product owner to double that revenue per point. Figure out how to do that. Because if the Scrum Master can double the productivity for the team and deliver twice as many points, and then the product owner can double the revenue per point, then you have 400% more revenue. And given our current situation where revenue is going down for most companies, this is going to be really, really important to get serious about this. Survival is going to depend on it.
That's a good point.
Yeah, excellent point. So I think we have time for just, one more question. We're really pushing the time here, but we've gotten so many great ones that I want to make sure we're addressing them. A lot of people have just asked very, bluntly, what are some tools? What are the platforms? What do we do to make this remote working and this remote management work? So if you could share some examples of what you use in your organizations and how you effectively communicate.
Yeah, I'll add some of my favorites, but I do think that, if we're talking about, and Jeff, tell me if you agree. I think we're talking about Scrum. The nice thing is it's a lightweight framework, right? It's not a lot of ceremony, not a lot of overhead. And of course, there are tools that help, but it really comes down, in my opinion, tools that help with communication, with obviously things like Atlassian, Jira, and so forth for tracking and for maintaining documentation. But so much of it is about communication and discussion. And I think, Jeff, we were talking the other day about video conferencing, something we're doing kind of right now, and how amazingly valuable that is in this kind of work from home situation where, I think, Jeff, I'll let you do this, but I think you made the argument that video conferencing is almost more expressive than being in the room with people these days. Is that right?
What I noticed, I'm on the team that delivers training at Scrum Inc. And now today it's all remote training. So, and we pivoted very quickly. Within a week, we flipped every training to remote. And then we had a sprint review the Tuesday afternoon, and we're kind of reviewing that. I said, I think the training works as well remotely as it does in person. There are some benefits you don't get, but in the remote setting, things are a lot more focused. Like right now, I can see your faces very closely, much closer than if I was in a room with.
You're making me a little uncomfortable, Jeff.
And I can see how you're feeling, and when I'm talking, you don't have 30 people around you distracting you. You're sitting alone, so I think the messaging can be much clearer. So in some ways, this kind of setting is more intimate and the communication is clearer. So this is an advantage of the remote training. We're going to go back to face-to-face training as soon as we can, but I don't think we'll probably always do half remote training now, because we think it works just as well. And we did our first remote training. I've got a guy in Hong Kong, and I've got a guy in Poland. We've got people all over the United States. We're working with them for 2 days. They didn't have to fly across the world to get in the same room, and we had, I think, as good an experience.
That's cool.
All right. Well, thank you. We have even gone over our time a little bit, so thank you everyone for joining us and staying on with us. And thank you both, Jeff Sutherland, Steve Howe. Thank you for your time today. As mentioned to everyone, we will be sharing a link to this webinar. So post this, you'll be able to view it. You can share it with your colleagues, whoever you think could benefit from this. We'll also be taking a look at all of the questions that you submitted today and trying to answer them to our best ability, and send that out along too, so that any of you who didn't get your question answered, we can respond to it. And in the meantime, if you have any other questions around how to effectively manage remote teams, or how to leverage Scrum as a methodology, please reach out to us at education@gonewfire.com. We'll be happy to assist you. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.